Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Tokyo Living Podcast. Today, I'm going to be starting a new series of shows on the podcast talking about some common musculoskeletal conditions and common areas where people report pain. Now, these will be fairly brief explanations. We're just going to be talking about some common diagnoses that are made of pain in certain areas and some common treatment strategies. As always, the common disclaimer, this isn't to be considered medical information. If you do have pain in these areas, please either come and see us or go and see another qualified medical practitioner. Or if you do have some follow-up questions from the content in these episodes, please leave them in the comment section or feel free to direct message me. Likewise, if you have areas of the body that you would like me to cover in these episodes, please let me know. I'm always looking for ideas for the type of content that people want to receive. Before we get into specific conditions, I'm going to spend today's episode talking about the concept of load. So this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. The concept of load basically underpins the diagnosis, the assessment, and the treatment for essentially any pain condition or any musculoskeletal pain condition for that matter, or any injury that someone has, or in terms of structuring their rehabilitation. Essentially, our bodies or our systems are in a constant state of balance between the demands that we're placing on the system and our capacity to tolerate those demands. And so this exists both from a psychological perspective, it happens in social constructs, and it happens with our physiology. And generally what happens when we experience pain or when we have an injury or when we have an illness, the demands that are being placed on our system by whatever it is that is contributing to the pain, whether it's our activity, whether it's our work, whether it's an infection or a disease that's placing stress on the system, and our capacity to deal with that stress is out of balance. And that's essentially what leads to any pain, injury, illness state. And this usually happens in the context of time. So in both an acute injury setting and an overuse injury setting. So an acute injury, for example, if I was tackled with a force of 10,000 newtons and that tackle occurred in 0.2 seconds, then the area that was tackled, let's say it's my knee that was put under stress, it may be able to tolerate that stress. However, if that same 10,000 newtons was applied in 0.1 seconds, so a shorter time frame, then the force versus time equation is thrown into a place where that tissue that's under stress may no longer be able to tolerate that stress and may give way and may cause a structural injury, which then leads to pain. So that's a basic acute example. An overuse or persistent pain example would be, let's say I wanted to increase my running volume from 20 kilometers per week to 40 kilometers per week. And let's say I did that in a time frame of 10 weeks. My body might have the capacity to be able to deal with that and not be overloaded and not get into a state of pain and or injury. However, if I try to increase from 20 kilometers to 40 kilometers, then that may, in a space of, say, 4 weeks, then again, that force, that stress, that load versus time balance has been thrown out. And I may start to experience overload of the system and therefore pain. Now, these are purely hypothetical numbers, just made those up just to illustrate how time and load sort of work together. So when we talk about load, there's a number of different aspects of the system that can contribute to the total load with which our system experiences. I like to use this Venn diagram to illustrate those different types of load and how they sort of work together. So on the top left of this diagram, we have what we call tissue-specific load. And then on the bottom right, we have systemic load. Top right, we have direct load. And bottom left, we have indirect load. So the first aspect we'll discuss is what we call the tissue-specific direct load, or direct tissue-specific load. And this is what most people think of when they think of the cause of pain or injury. So the specific site where the pain is coming from, or where we think it is coming from. Essentially, what we're talking about there is what we call in medical terms nociception. So there is some sort of structural danger or some sort of tissue stress in the body that is being perceived by the brain and by the central nervous system. These receptors, which we call nociceptors, they basically pick up danger signals from the periphery. Now, these nociceptors aren't able to give us information regarding the type of stimulus, the type of danger that's happening. They're basically just there to tell us that something bad is going on. We need other nerve fibers, other receptors to complement that information to actually give our brain a little bit better idea of what's going on. When we're assessing the tissue-specific load, in the case of an acute injury, we need to know what happened. What was the mechanism of injury? How did you twist? How did you fall? What part of the body did you make direct contact with? What muscles were involved in a particular motion? What joints, what position of the joint may have influenced the structures that have been stressed, so that we can look at starting to make a working diagnosis, or at least have an idea of the direction in which the body has been stressed, and what we need to do to try and decrease that nociception that is contributing to someone's pain. Now, in terms of diagnosis, sometimes having a specific diagnosis is important. So obviously, in the case of a fracture, we need to know if there has been a fracture to the bone, because that is going to significantly change the management plan. If there is a specific muscle tear, then we need to know, what muscle has been torn, so that we know how to offload it, and then how to rehabilitate it, how to gradually increase that muscle's capacity to tolerate load to return back to function. In some areas of the body, however, the diagnosis isn't as important. So especially in the spine, your lower back and neck issues, for the most part, unless there is, again, like a fracture or a bony injury, or if there's signs of nerve compromise, so numbness, weakness, those type of symptoms, diagnosis for back pain isn't usually necessary. We can often have structural compromise, so herniated discs, degenerated facet joints, things like that we know are fairly prevalent in asymptomatic populations. So they're not really well correlated with pain. And once we start basing our diagnosis and our management plan around those structures which are probably not related in a large way to someone's pain, then it can sort of throw us off and take us down the track of treatments that are not only not required, but potentially harmful as well. So the process of making a diagnosis really depends on the context of the injury, the body part that's been injured, and how that injury has occurred. In terms of initial management, when we're talking about direct tissue-specific load, the initial management will usually require some type of offloading, some type of deloading. Now, this may be in the case of a fracture, it may be immobilization. It may even be internal fixation. We may have to open up that body part and perform a surgical operation to stabilize that bone. In the case of a bad joint sprain, it might require a certain amount of time where we're offloading through non-weight bearing, getting on crutches, trying to take some weight off that area. In the case of a muscle strain, it may just be, restricting activity. So, not walking or running too much for maybe even just a couple of days to allow it to settle and then build back up. In the case of, say, a tendon issue, a tendinopathy, if we've overloaded that tissue, then we might just need to avoid doing the aggravating activity for a period of time to allow that to settle down. However, we do need to, at some point, build that back up. So even with a bone, we can't just allow a bone to heal and then go back to our previous levels of activity. Direct tissue-specific treatment involves increasing that tissue's ability to tolerate load. So once we start walking, we need to gradually build up our walking volume. We need to build up to running, jumping, whatever it is that we need to get back to. And the same with all of our other tissues. So once we have some degree of decrease in pain, decrease in sensitivity, we need to start loading those tissues up. If it's a muscle or a tendon, we need to get those muscles contracting and gradually increase the load that we're putting on them, the weight that we're lifting, the speed that we're moving, how fast we're running, so that when we go back to our level of activity, those tissues have the capacity to withstand the loads that we're putting on them and are less likely to fail and less likely to cause problems in other areas of the body. Now, this isn't a dichotomy in terms of we allow things to settle down. They've settled down. Okay, now we can build back up. These often happen together. So while we're allowing something to settle down, say we've got an angry Achilles tendon, we might be backing off running to allow it to settle down. But at the same time, we might be applying a very specific stimulus through that tendon to allow it to adapt, get stronger, and again, be better at tolerating load. And this is where the importance of understanding what an exercise is meant to do is really important. So we might be doing an exercise for the quadriceps where we're trying to in simple terms, straighten out our leg against some sort of resistance, which will be strengthening the quadriceps, but it will also be desensitizing and improving the capacity of the patellar tendon, which attaches those quadriceps onto the shin bone. If we're dealing with an overuse injury, we want to know, how much have we been using that part of the body? So, if we have a tennis elbow, did we increase our tennis playing by 100%, and has that caused it? Obviously, a lot of other things can cause tennis elbow apart from playing tennis, but that's sort of just the simplest example. If we've got an Achilles issue because of running, how much running have we done? And has there been something there with our load modification or our load management strategy that has caused this imbalance in load that has then contributed to this injury? So that's essentially what we're talking about in terms of the direct tissue-specific load. We'll move on now to indirect tissue-specific load. So we're still talking about the tissues of the body, but now we're talking about areas away from the site of injury or the site where we think that nociception is arising. And so in this regard, we're talking about biomechanics. We're talking about things like, strength, power, mobility, flexibility, and also things like technique, equipment, ergonomics, things like that. So let's say, for example, we have pain in our elbow. We want to figure out the tissue-specific load, what structure might be involved, how we're going to manage that structure, how we're going to build it up to tolerate the load, and what sort of things have caused it, and how we modify our activity and build back up our activity to allow that area to settle down and then adapt. But we're also looking at the rest of the body and how that might be influencing what's going on with that elbow injury. So you might have, let's say that you are an overhead athlete, tennis player, a thrower. You may have some compromised shoulder function that is influencing what's happening with the elbow. So you might have some restricted range of motion. So we'll assess your shoulder range of motion. You may have some restriction on that side, which is affecting how you're performing your activity, and that is putting excess pressure on the elbow. Or you might have some wrist stiffness, or you may have some weakness through the abdominals, which is affecting how your force transfer mechanism is operating when you're performing that task, and again, overloading the injured site. So, strength and weakness in relevant areas of the body are important things to look at. Sometimes this is, overly focused on at the detriment of actually not focusing on the injured area and looking at load that might be putting stress on there. But it is an important consideration, and it becomes an even more important consideration when there's been a change in biomechanics. So let's say you have had a previous shoulder injury, and now you've got elbow pain, then there's probably a greater likelihood of that being involved than had you not had an area, an injury in an area related to the injury site where you're currently experiencing the pain. So, and generally, the further away from the injury site, the less relevant things become. But you still need to look at, in some cases, the entire chain. So let's say someone is a baseball pitcher. They may have some restriction in their big toe that is throwing the whole kinetic chain out and putting pressure on the shoulder and causing pain in the shoulder. It's far less likely, but it is still a possibility. So that's where we need to look at the type of activity that is causing someone pain and all the things that might be influencing the load on the injured site within that task. So that's where we talk about biomechanics. Technique is important. So technique might be, sporting technique, the way that you're doing a certain movement, especially if it is something that's new to you. If you've just taken up CrossFit and you're not quite sure with some of the Olympic lifts, then it may be a technique thing that needs to be addressed to try and take stress off the sensitized tissue. Or if there has been a change in technique. So your sporting coach wants to try something different to, ideally optimize performance, but that change in technique has caused an excessive increase in load on a certain tissue, then that may need to be addressed. Technique might be something that you do work-wise. So if you're working with two computers, and you've got one directly in front of you and one off to the side, your technique of working might involve repeated movement to the left-hand side. So that needs to be adjusted in order to, and as a result, you may have some neck pain, for example. The way that you're working, you may need to change that. So you're spending equal time rotating to both directions to even out the stress on what we presume is a tissue, direct tissue specific load in terms of the neck pain. Equipment is another one. So if you're using sporting equipment, rackets, balls, footwear is a massive one. So in runners, the footwear may be a part of the indirect tissue specific load that is contributing to someone's pain. And so that may need to be addressed as well. And then ergonomics, and we sort of touched on this with the monitors, but things like working on a laptop instead of a desktop if you've started having to work from home, or maybe you've been working from home, you're used to a laptop, now you're going back to a desktop, and you're changing your posture, you're changing your position, especially when there has been a change and then the pain has started after that change, then it's possible that the ergonomics may be contributing to the problem as well. So that's all the indirect tissue-specific load that we consider when we're looking at someone's pain. The next one, over to the right, we're talking about direct loads in terms of the systemic load. So systemic load, we're now starting to move away from the actual injured tissue and thinking about, all the things that might be going on in the body that might be contributing to the issues that we're experiencing. So we might be talking about the overall activity we're doing. So let's say we're doing an activity, we're experiencing some shoulder pain, and we have a balanced activity profile where we might be doing a little bit of racket sports, some resistance training. And then we've decided that we want to run a marathon. So we're going to do some running work on top of all the other things that we're doing. So we start running and we start doing a lot of running, and all of a sudden our shoulder hurts while we're doing our racket sports. Now, that may be a result of introducing the running, even though the running biomechanically isn't influencing the shoulder. It's not tissue. We haven't increased our tissue-specific stress, but we have increased our systemic stress. So our ability to recover, the overall fatigue of the system is increased, and that may be enough to put excess stress on an area where we're performing the same activity. But it's just our entire system is under load. We also need to consider the load from other illnesses. If we are, immunocompromised, if we've had a cold, if we've had coronavirus, and then we're going back to exercising at the same level that we were before, then it may be increased systemic stress that is driving an injury. So that we need to sort of take that all into account and not just look at the injured site. So that's what we're talking about in terms of systemic load, in terms of direct load. And I do like to break this down into physiological and psychological, because the psychological load can have a massive impact on pain as well. So when we are under psychological stress, I tend to liken it to a computer. I tend to have a lot of applications on my computer, so it often operates a little slowly. your brain is in the same way. So if you've got a lot of things on your mind, a lot of stress, the brain isn't interpreting that nociception, those messages that are coming from the periphery. It's not interpreting them in the same way, and its ability to deal with those messages is compromised, and so that is going to affect the pain that we're experiencing as an output, because that's really what pain is. So pain is essentially a protective output that occurs in response to some sort of threat, and it might be the threat of that nociception coming from the injured area. It might be the threat from overall load on the system, or a virus or something else, or it may be that we have some psychological stress that is causing threat to the system. And in all of those things, if our system is under increased psychological load, it just can't deal with that stress as accurately as it should or appropriately, and so we'll have pain as sort of that default mechanism. Also, when we're under psychological stress, our hormonal system changes as well. So we might be producing excessive amounts of cortisol. And when our hormonal system, our immune system, our endocrine system is functioning differently, then the stimulus we're getting from the nerves, from the periphery, that's going to be in a different environment as well. I liken this to the previous car I owned had a faulty alarm system whereby the alarm should have sounded when someone was in contact with the car, someone got too close to the car. However, when it was raining, the alarm would sound just when I pulled up at the lights. So depending on the environment that we're in, my car was very sensitive when it was under a certain environment, and your nervous system might be very sensitive when you're stressed, and more sensitive than it should be, and more likely to cause pain when exposed to that same amount of stress. So that's our systemic load, our direct systemic load. The last one is what I like to call indirect systemic load. So this is things like general health, sleep, nutrition, beliefs, and the influence of others. So our general health, we talked about this before, but if we're experiencing an illness, this may impact on our systemic load. If we're taking medication, that may also change the sensitivity of the system. The sleep that we're getting, so if our sleep is compromised, that is going to be increasing our systemic load and decreasing our recoverability and increasing the sensitivity of the nervous system. Our nutrition, this can, whether it's the fact that we might be have a low tolerance to some sort of foods, and that creates an inflammatory state in our system, which then leads to inflammation around certain body parts, and that leads to pain, whether it be that we've gained weight, and that gain in weight has increased the mechanical load on parts of the body, or more likely increased the inflammatory response. So, fat cells, especially when we're carrying a little bit of fat around, a little bit more fat around the tummy than we're used to, then that fat in itself produces an inflammatory response that can cause pain. So if you've gained weight, a substantial amount of weight recently, and then you've had pain secondary to this, then that may be a big part of the puzzle. On the flip side, undernutrition. So if you're not eating enough, if you've increased your training load, but you haven't increased your dietary intake, then you may be underfueling for the activity that you're performing, and that can lead to general pain. So the body's ability to recover is decreased. You're going to have more sensitivity, but it can lead to more specific problems. So things like RED-S, so relative energy deficiency in sport, is associated with bony injuries and things like that, and that is something that really needs to be taken seriously. And it's for those sort of conditions, it's a lot more than just the dietary component, but it does have a big play. It's does play a big part in the management. So that's sort of the physiological side of the indirect tissue-specific load. The indirect systemic load. And then the last part is the psychological load. Here, we're sort of thinking more about the beliefs around the pain and the influence of other people. So if we think that a part of our body is damaged, if we have seen a scan that shows a herniated disc or a torn rotator cuff tear or a torn meniscus, and we're made to believe that that is the source of the pain. Now, it may be, but it may not be. And that's why we need to take everything into account together. So as we talked about before, pain is a protective response that is triggered in relation to some sort of threat. And some of that threat may be what we believe is going on in our bodies. So again, as we discussed before, pain is essentially an alarm that is triggered in response to some sort of threat. And that threat may be what we believe is going on in our bodies. So if we believe that something is terribly wrong, is out of place, is dislocated or unstable, then that is going to increase our vigilance. It's going to increase the threat associated with the pain that we experience, and therefore is going to increase the pain itself. So pain education, increasing our understanding around what is causing our pain is a big part of management of this psychological component of the indirect systemic load. So I hope that has been of use to you and has been somewhat interesting. As I said, we base all our assessments and our management around this concept of load and how we manipulate different parts of load, how we assess the different parts of load to try and get an understanding of what the root cause of someone's pain or injury is. And then we use that to guide our treatment. So I will be referring back to this from time to time throughout this series when we talk about different conditions. But I thought it was good to get a bit of a grounding in this sort of philosophy so that you understand where we're coming from. So I hope you've enjoyed that. Like I said, if you do have areas of the body that you would like me to speak about, please let me know. Otherwise, we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Tokyo Living Podcast. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Take care.